Good morning, everybody. Today's date is Monday, June 15th, 2020, and I am your host, Tom Kaczynski, for episode 83 of Coronavirus Central, your one-stop shop for basically the world falling apart one day at a time, right? That seems what it's happening these days, and today I am coming to you live, you might say, from a hot zone. I am today down in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania visiting some family, but I've had the opportunity this weekend to visit Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, a lot of the areas that were most heavily hit at the beginning, or I should say beginning to middle of this pandemic, and we'll talk about that in a second. I want to share some on-the-ground intel with you that'll be useful, and then we'll go into a show today where here at Coronavirus Central, we're going to cover what is starting to happen with the disease, some of the pieces caught up in it, and then, of course, the larger social framework, which is already under great distress, as we reported in some depth next week. So I think the format for this week is going to be, we're going to look sort of at the disease and the numbers today a little bit, and what the expectations are for the second wave, or I shouldn't say it's even really a second wave, but the resumption of the first wave following an inadequate closure, and we're going to look at those numbers in some depth today. And look at what the consequences are like on the ground. On Wednesday, we'll probably get into some of the social unrest issues that come out of this. There's a lot of them. It's ugly, and it's getting worse, and it will end up being a focal point of the show because of necessity and because of my determination to keep you safe. And then Friday, I like to connect the economic and international pieces. So I'm not promising what Wednesday and Friday are going to look like. I should be back home by then. But here from the road, I want to thank everyone who's helping support the broadcast. Venmo is CVCPRV, as well as your donations and kind letters to P.O. Box 35, Greenville Junction, Maine, 04442. Also, coronaviruscentral@pm.me is the email, and a lot of you wrote me some things, and I got back to most of you, and if I missed you, I apologize. I had a chance to finally do a little bit of writing. I've had a lot of time out here in the hinterlands looking at things, and if you want to get up to date with what I had been doing, check out previous episodes at coronaviruscentral.net, and given the speed with which things are decelerating, I highly recommend you might want to join the open source intelligence network at t.me/coronaviruscentral. I do anticipate sometime in the not-so-distant future communications may be a problem, as well as censorship of this program, because we're going to report things as they are, not as we wish them to be, and that is not going to be popular because we live in an age where that isn't supported. I know this because I had the opportunity to visit a number of places. I was in the suburbs of Boston, Massachusetts, in Buffalo, New York, and now I'm not too far from Williamsport, Pennsylvania. And what I will say is that, if you go around and you go out, people are basically in a post-pandemic mindset for the most part. I mean, maybe I'm just seeing the people who are out there, but let me tell you, there are a lot of people out there, and whatever restrictions are theoretically in place, they are not being followed. And I understand why people don't follow them at this point, because it didn't seem that bad. The media has downplayed it, and everyone is following either the directions of the media in their hypocrisy, where they were going out there and saying how terrible this was, and then not acting that way when they found an issue they liked better that was more disruptive, or listening to governments who have put standards out there that people aren't either listening because they don't agree with the government ideologically, which is one set of people, or because economic reasons compel them to act, which is perhaps a better set of reasons, or just because people are generally ignorant of the risk of this virus. The tragic thing is, and I've been out here with some small risk to myself, I've been mostly segregated, but watching people going around with masks that are inadequate, no eye protection, and just putting themselves at the risk of any amount of contamination and harm. And I do understand that to this point, we've been fortunate that most people who seem to have had this have come through with a mild expression. And that is something we, of course, hope will continue, although we live in a very strange time. And as I've told multiple people, my personal expectation remains that as the preponderance of evidence suggests this was man-made, and as we see other geostrategic factors coming into place, I think it's almost naivete to think there won't be a second wave of a more virulent strain of COVID, especially if it serves a useful purpose and has plausible deniability, because America is in big trouble. And for those who are international listeners, you really don't understand how this country is posed on a knife's edge in a lot of ways, because on one hand, we have a situation where life for 95% of Americans goes on very much like normal. However, for 5%, whether they're protesters in the streets, whether they're the police officers who are losing their jobs, all of these sort of people out there, or whether it's the expectations of a country where the government has fundamentally shown itself unwilling, unable, or unwanting to exercise authority in the face of certain challenges of civil disruption. Whether you consider that unrest or justice is probably an ideological question. But in any case, what we have is a breakdown of an existing system of law and order. The president is absent, the governors seem absent, and we really don't have leadership out there. And in the absence of leadership, chaos cannot help but result. So look for things to get more chaotic. And what that means is if governors decide to step in at any point and say, we are going to reimpose standards for the coronavirus, not only will that not be permitted, it will be actively opposed. The majority, or at least a vast portion of the right, is convinced it's utterly a hoax. And after the way in which article after article, as we reported, went out there and basically said, you can't say the protest can't happen, but your whole business and livelihood could be destroyed, your church could be disrupted. It's very easy to understand how and why that happens. And you could say it's an unhappy circumstance of time, or you could say it's a load of crap. What you choose to believe is your business. But here's my observation from the field. People are done with the virus. They have accepted it in the sense that they're willing to go out there and they will wear a mask and they will practice a little bit of distancing. But ultimately, even that's a load of crap, because let's be honest with you. We have people wearing cloth masks that don't protect against a virus that's small, and the government tells us it's okay. We have people who are distancing at 6 feet when a sneeze goes 21 feet, and the government's telling you that's okay. So I have to almost conclude at this point that CDC standards are designed to cause this to spread. The economic actions of our government are set up in such a way, and going to Wall Street, where we are not even encouraged to take the sort of actions that would allow people to be safe. And this virus was allowed to simmer rather than be stopped. And I understand all the reasons why that happened, and I understand the policy questions, and so do you, about how choices were made to benefit some at the expense of others. And the cynic in me, as commented on Friday, cannot help but notice that, ultimately the corporations are happy to sponsor anything that draws attention away from the fact that they got a bailout of monumental proportions from the central bank at the expense of cheapening the dollar of every American in the country. Talking about dollar weakness is something we'll have going forward. I had literally 3 or 4 people ask me, what should I be doing with my retirement right now? And what I have to say to people is, you have to ask yourself the question, what is the dollar? How much is it worth? Why does it retain value? And that's caught up in the faith and credit of the United States government. Look on the dollar bill, full faith and tender, and it's backed by the security of our government. But how confident do you feel in the stability of our government? If you're someone outside the United States and you're looking at this mess we have, it's easy to say, hey, a dollar with this many problems and a government this dysfunctional. If America ends up fighting itself, the dollar itself gets destroyed. And this is just one more example of the commonly described cascade effects, which are at the heart of our problems. But today, I want to try to be slightly narrower with the show. We're going to go ahead and just report on some neurological stuff. This is going to be kind of more like high level than a super deep dive, necessitated by the fact that I'm traveling. But I think as we see everyone kind of going crazy in their minds, it's not a bad idea to look at maybe the fact is we're going crazy, not just because of all the stresses we're dealing with, which certainly would be enough to put many people over the top, but also the fact that COVID in its own weird little way might be making us crazy too a little bit. So we got two pieces on the neurology of this that are smaller pieces but do link to larger studies that are worth taking a look at. And then we're going to look at the numbers of what's happening. And not surprising to anyone in this audience, I'm looking at the top 5 states in terms of daily cases: California, Florida, North Carolina, Texas, and Arizona. Why would you expect that to happen? Well, that's not very hard to judge. Who reopened, right? And I told you 2-3 weeks ago, when we're talking about this, the states that reopen earlier are going to be the ones that get pounded. And let's just go through real fast, because I think it would be instructive to talk about what states are out there. And these aren't the total numbers. These are just in the last 24 hours who's had the most cases reported, okay? California, 2,615. Florida, 1,972. North Carolina, 1,419. Texas, 1,339. Arizona, 1,046. Alabama, 1,014. Tennessee, 883. Georgia, 880. South Carolina, 840. So that just gives you a feeling of what you will not be lost on you is that every one of those states is south of the Mason-Dixon line, and that the southeast with those states that had opened up early is being pummeled. You got Florida, North Carolina, Alabama, Tennessee, Georgia, South Carolina. Looks like somehow Mississippi escaped the cutting edge, but that's about the only one down there. And the other states, California, Texas, Arizona. Theory, I think that one of the things that may be spreading this is a lot of people thought the warmer states would be safe, but the warmer states also, as they reopened, had a lot of places with air conditioning, recirculating the air around in a way where people would risk higher exposure to the virus. I certainly know growing up in Arizona, you couldn't go anywhere in Phoenix without having frosty air conditioning at full blast. Otherwise, that city literally would not exist. And if you look at that, it's just one example. And, you wonder about the places where these are happening. These are the numbers we're seeing. And fortunately, so far, the death counts are very modest. If I were to take the top line number for the United States, and let's zoom out here a little bit so we can kind of see what's happening in terms of the larger number. And I will say all these numbers are coming to us courtesy of COVID19.info. Or I should say now it's COVID19info.live. Let's see if I can reset this here. So as of right now, confirmed globally, 8,058,823 cases, deaths 438,853. In the United States, in the last 24 hours, and mind you, this is after Sunday, so those numbers are always short on Sundays, or on a Monday, so don't read too much into it. But we had 20,004 new cases, and 331 new deaths were added, up to a total of 117,858. The good news is that treatment regimens thus far have been better set up, but as we see this wave build, will we run into some of the issues from before about shortage of supplies, about novel forms of treatment? Something to keep an eye on, something I'm very worried about. And then the rest of the top 10 offenders, Brazil is just off to the races, 867,000. We'll just round up, 868,000 in Brazil, 537,000 in Russia. India is getting a big number now, 333,000, 298,000 in the UK. Those are your top 5. Then we got Spain at 291, Italy at 237, Peru 230, France at 190, and Germany, interestingly, at 187. So those seem to be catching up. The good news is the numbers of deaths are flattening just a bit, but we're still sitting at a recorded 5.4% death rate. And we'll have to see, because as waves come into reopening, waves is the wrong word, because a lot of people either got this and it went away fast, or this is still the first wave percolating about. So this isn't a different form of the virus, I don't think, or at least I don't have evidence to suggest, other than the D614G, which is really what helped spread it as part of what we consider the first wave. So we'll have to keep an eye on that, and I do anticipate we may deal with some real problems in the future beyond what we already have on our plate, and isn't it bad enough? Okay, so that's a quick peek at what's happening globally. The next two pieces, I'm drawing these both from Medical Express, which is sort of a medical aggregator, but it's kind of a useful way to do it and gives you kind of a top-level look at things as we go through today's show. So this piece was from June 11th. COVID-19 threatens the entire nervous system, and this was published by Northwestern University. A new review of neurological symptoms of COVID patients in the current scientific literature reveals the disease poses a global threat to the entire nervous system, reports a Northwestern Medicine study published this week in the Annals of Neurology. About half of hospitalized patients have neurological manifestations of COVID, which include headache, dizziness, decreased alertness, difficulty concentrating, disorders of smell and taste, seizures, strokes, weakness, and muscle pain. So let me pull two pieces out of this. One of the common things that's talked about with COVID is this disorder of smell that seems to be one of the more useful things, or not useful, commonly expressed traits of this disease. And it's indicative of, loss of taste, loss of smell, lack of awareness. And it's sort of thought as a mild symptom. But as you see some of these other things connected to it, like the headache, the dizziness, the difficulty concentrating, one wonders to what extent COVID is neurological, because as these symptoms continue and recur over time as a chronic manner. There was another interesting piece, I'm not covering it today, but it was talking about how HIV literally sits in the brain sometimes. In fact, maybe I'll bring it up. It's worth mentioning, so I'll find it and put it in there. But what I wanted you to understand is that we have neurological manifestations of COVID happening over time that start with what's seen as a minor disorder, but then lead to different neurological functions being hindered in a lot of ways. And then you go to some of these stronger ones like seizure, stroke, weakness, muscle pain. Those are things that are happening too, though less commonly. And one wonders over time how this all plays out. We don't know yet, but the long-term symptoms is something we've always been aware of on this program and something we're concerned about because there's many, many personal testimonials, including some of the members of our own community who have shared it quite openly, that absent taking a ton of supplements and doing things to maintain health, what they find is they very quickly descend into status of much poorer health. And while supplies are easily and readily available, they're able to enjoy a relatively high amount of life with minimal disruptions. I wonder how that plays in the longer term if you have people who need things to function to be safe, and as you see that functionality becoming less available. I have to tell you, when I'm thinking about things these days, I'm often thinking from the context of what if COVID was part of an asymmetrical attack launched against the world by some unknown entity to accomplish an end? What is it going to functionally accomplish, and what might be other things you fear come out of it, whether that's China taking advantage of an opportunity or a tragedy forced on them, or whether it's some shadowy actor behind the scenes. Ultimately, it's not so important that I understand the origin story as I consider, as we look at what sort of threats are out there, and that's really what I want you to be aware of, what risks exist. And I continue to hold to the point I've held since the very beginning of this, that you really don't want to get this virus. And it is upsetting and frustrating to me personally, as well as to, I suspect, many of us, that because of other factors that are being deliberately provoked, I would argue largely by a media that has just been horrible beyond their usual level in trying to cause decay and disruption at a time when we really needed to come together to fight COVID. Now we are in a spot where now we're going to have to run other risks that are more and more terrible, but they don't make sense in terms of a group of people who wanted to keep people safe. They don't make terms in terms of a sense of people who want to fight the virus. They make a lot of sense in terms of entities trying to disrupt, destabilize the Western world and lead to a new world order, to use the infamous phrase, of unknown provenance. So let's keep an eye on that. And when I tell you certain things, it's not because I know these things are true. I don't, and I'm not going to say things I don't know are true, but I will tell you my paranoid mind is pretty good at asking questions that are out there. And I will say, as we watch things being destroyed within this country, our economy, our political stability, our civil society, as we watch our ability to even function together really being pushed upon, I remain incredibly concerned, and I do wonder what role COVID is playing beyond the sort of simple suggestion that I think people make wrongly, that it was a stimulus to kick off these events. I think it's an ongoing actor of incredible import that has a lot more to say, and that I think the danger of overlooking it is short-sighted strategically and tactically. So we'll have to see what's going on with that. So let's continue this piece, though, from Medical Express. This was out of Northwestern University here. It's important for the general public and physicians to be aware of this because a SARS-2 infection may present with neurologic symptoms initially before any fever, cough, or respiratory problems occur, said the lead author of the review, Dr. Igor Koralnik, Northwestern Medicine Chief of Neuroinfectious Diseases and Global Neurology and a professor of neurology at the Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine. The review describes the different neurological conditions that may occur in COVID patients and how to diagnose them, as well as likely pathogenic mechanisms. This understanding is key to direct appropriate clinical management and treatment, Koralnik said. The disease may affect the entire nervous system, including the brain, spinal cord, and nerves, as well as the muscles. There are many ways COVID can cause neurological dysfunction, he said. Because this disease may affect multiple organs, lung, kidney, heart, and we know there are others besides this, anywhere where we see the common receptors, right? Whether it be ACE2, CD26, CD28, was it 147? Any of these receptors, and remember, that's what this virus is good at. That's what it's set up for. That's where the manufacturing of the gain of function, the insert would end up working, where that clade is set up really well to go ahead and allow, it's even optimized, to be honest with you, for the virus to attack humanity. And this is one of the pieces that you've seen more and more people talk about, this man-made likelihood in the fact that if this was a natural disease that came from a bat or a pangolin and jumped to a human, you would see it have a worse presentation or more efficacy in connecting to those, and then it just happened to also impact humans. But in fact, you see the opposite, that this virus is uniquely suited to infect humanity, and it just happens to infect others. And I'll give you an example that might substantiate this, is we reported on cats getting sick and ferrets getting sick, or at least testing positive with this, and yet the expression in them seems to be much milder. Why is that? Well, because the virus isn't really optimized for their genome. It's optimized for ours, and there's been a lot more research coming out about that beyond what we discussed last week. And I think that that is an interesting piece and quite frankly, a compelling piece of circumstantial evidence that this is deliberately designed with a goal to being able to impact humanity. Now, whether it was released intentionally or not is a question we cannot necessarily know from that, but that whomever was working on it and, coming from Wuhan where research was done on this very issue, it's likely that the research being done was about how coronaviruses impact humanity. And so whatever modifications were made for whatever reason seem to fit that basic theme. All right. So let's go ahead and talk about the neurological. So Dr. Koralnik said, this understanding is key to direct appropriate clinical management treatment. The disease may affect the entire nervous system, including the brain, spinal cord. I read all that. Sorry. Koralnik and his colleagues have formed a neuro-COVID research team and started a retrospective analysis of all COVID patients hospitalized at Northwestern Medicine to determine the frequency and type of neurological complications as well as response to treatment. Since knowledge about the long-term outcome of neurologic manifestations of COVID is limited, Koralnik will also follow some of these patients prospectively in his new outpatient neuro-COVID clinic to determine if neurological problems are temporary or permanent. These studies will provide the foundation on how to diagnose, manage, and treat the many neurologic manifestations of COVID, he said. It's exciting to hear that we have doctors looking and actively tracking people for the long-term neurological symptoms. I'm very curious to see what's coming, so we'll definitely keep a very close eye on what's coming out of this. I know it's of a lot of concern to all of us in our audience. So I want to add this other piece too. This piece is, once again, this is from Medical Express, but it's reporting on a piece from the Journal of Alzheimer's disease. 3 stages to COVID-19 brain damage identified by neurologists, and this is by iOS Press, okay? So let's read this. The Journal of Alzheimer's Disease has published a paper with a comprehensive review of COVID-19's effect on the nervous system, which classifies brain damage caused by COVID into 3 stages. One of the authors, nationally recognized neurologist Dr. Majid Fatuhi, MD, PhD, who is the medical director of the NeuroGrow Brain Fitness Center in Northern Virginia and affiliate staff at Johns Hopkins Medicine, encourages the adoption of this 3-stage classification, calls for more research on COVID's long-term effects on the brain, and stresses the need for patients to receive a brain MRI before leaving the hospital. We are learning that a significant number of hospitalized COVID patients have various degrees of brain impairment. let me insert one thing here before we go forward. And remember, a lot of the people who have mild expression of this have as one of the most common symptoms the expression of loss in taste and smell. And is that a neurological manifestation of the virus going right for the brain? I think that's a question we have to ask, because there's two ways you can lose your sense of taste and smell, right? The first way is if you go ahead and you have problem at the site, in the nose, in the back of the throat, all those places where those systems are, you could have disruption there, in the same way that if you get a runny nose or something, you can't smell right. So there's a physical disruption, a barrier at the point of entry. But conversely, a second way it could happen is if something happens in your brain to impede your awareness of those senses. And one of the problems that happens that makes neurological disorders very difficult to understand for many people is that you have a situation where it is often the case that you have manifestations of problems without the supporting physical stimulus. Dana certainly has dealt with this with her chronic Lyme disease, as have many other people with disorders, MS, lupus, ALS, different things out there, where you have problems that happen in the neurological system that lead to symptoms that people experience that do not have the manifestation. And for a long time, and still sadly far too often, it happens that people say, well, it's just in your head or it's a psychological action. But what can sometimes happen is actually, no, it's not that. It is in your head, but it's in your head in the sense that there is some disruption to your neurological system where the stimulus is not properly interpreted by the brain, and rather than the conscious choice of mind not adapting, literally there is an impairment of some physiological capacity in the neurological system. So instead of you imagining you don't have a sense of smell, you really don't have a sense of smell. It's just not that your sensor isn't working, it's something in the wiring is messed up. And that is something that we really have to wonder about with COVID, as we see that there are these neurological symptoms, and that's one of the places where COVID could very easily hide, especially for people who have been worried about long-term actions coming out of this. And this is just looking at hospitalized patients, but I mention this because as people all seem to be going crazy, one wonders if the zombie disease isn't already in our heads, right? I mean, who knows? I don't think that's the case, but it's something to keep an eye on. Anyway, we are learning that a significant number of hospitalized COVID patients have various degrees of brain impairment. As medical community, we need to monitor these patients over time, as some of them may develop cognitive decline, attention deficit, brain fog, or Alzheimer's disease in the future. There is a lot we can do to promote brain healing in COVID patients, but we must first understand the nature and severity of the neurological deficits. At the patient level, getting a baseline MRI before leaving the hospital is imperative so that we have a starting point to evaluate and treat them, explained Fatuhi. In the just published paper, Dr. Fatuhi and his colleagues warn about neurological issues in patients who suffer from COVID, including stroke, seizures, confusion, dizziness, paralysis, and/or coma. Already 24 case reports are revealing the impact of COVID on the brains of patients. In fact, one study from Wuhan, China showed that 45% of patients with severe COVID illness experienced marked neurological deficits. Another study from France showed that 84% of ICU patients with COVID-19 have positive abnormalities on their neurological examination, and that 15% of patients who leave the ICU have residual dysexecutive function, which involves poor attention and difficulty with decision-making and controlling behavior. The paper proposes the adoption of a 3-stage neuro-COVID classification scheme to provide a basis from which to build on future hypotheses and investigations regarding SARS-CoV-2 in the nervous system. These stages include: Stage 1. The virus damage is limited to epithelial cells of nose and mouth, and the main symptoms include transient loss of smell and taste. Stage 2. The virus triggers a flood of inflammation called cytokine storm, which begins in the lungs and travels to the blood vessels throughout all body organs. This cytokine storm leads to the formation of blood clots, which cause small or large strokes in the brain. Stage 3. An explosive level of cytokine storm damages the blood-brain barrier, the protective insulation layer in the blood vessels of the brain. As a result, blood content, inflammatory markers, and virus particles invade the brain, and patients develop seizures, confusion, coma, or encephalopathy. So just real fast, just an insert here. If you get past that blood-brain barrier, that's where the problems become really bad and you're going to be dealing with long-term chronic disease. That's something that's sort of well understood from other symptoms, and why and how that happens is because of an immune response that is mischaracterized. Because cytokine storm, as we all know, is what happens when basically a disease, in this case COVID, learns how to manage the immune response in such a way that it actually serves to help advance the cause of the virus by either A, damaging the body, or B, being co-opted by it, almost captured by it, versus the idea that it happens timely in a way that destroys the virus. And we've talked about this, the problems with the B cells, the T cells. And the idea that COVID is an autoimmune disorder, I think, is one that people need to get more comfortable with. And it fits the genetics. I mean, the fact of it is, the way genetics work is a little bit simple, where in the sense, if you see a genome where the code looks like HIV and it acts like HIV, even if it isn't HIV, you should expect to see at least some manifestations of the same sort of symptoms out there. And I just use that as one example because in a lot of ways, that is what it's most reminiscent of in terms of the autoimmune functions. And it's something we'll talk about much more as we go forward, I'm sure. Fatuhi points out that many patients with COVID may have no noticeable neurological symptoms at first, but in some cases, patients may present with neurological symptoms even before they have fever, cough, or shortness of breath. In addition to having an MRI while at the hospital, he stresses that patients will need to be monitored a few months after their hospitalization. Our experience with previous forms of coronaviruses suggests in the long term, patients may develop depression, insomnia, Parkinson's disease, memory loss, or accelerated aging of the brain, elaborated Fatuhi. For those recovering from COVID, I recommend regular exercise, eating a heart-healthy diet, reducing stress, and improving sleep. These are critical ways patients can rejuvenate their brain and minimize having poor outcomes in the future. And I just want to add here, the reporting that I've received from at least 4 or 5 people at this point who have been diagnosed with COVID, who are younger, let's say from age 20 to 50, and in relatively good health, is that their body has a zero tolerance in a lot of ways if they don't keep to a very strict health friendly regimen, and they start having all sorts of these problems like the brain fog, confusion, and feeling badly in various forms. So I think the idea that there's a longer term, these are not people who had severe manifestations. 1 went to the hospital, 3 did not, of the 4 who I've talked to. And in those cases, I think it's really interesting. Of course, this is anecdotal, but we are trying to understand that if you don't take care of yourself, you really do end up in a bad way with this. And as we see a lot more people at risk of getting it going forward, it's something people need to be aware of because people are already sort of in a bad way, and adding a loss of mental capacity at a time of crisis really could lead to a lot of terrible outcomes. And it's a perfect storm of events that, if it isn't the most unhappy coincidence in history, suggests a level of planning that really is mind-boggling. And I worry about that very much, but more on that later. These interventions, along with targeted brain training and neurofeedback therapy, are the main features of Dr. Fatuhi's 12-week brain fitness program. As published in the Journal of Prevention of Alzheimer's Disease in 2016, 84% of elderly with cognitive impairment who complete this brain rehabilitation program gain improvement in their brain function, and many of them experience growth in the parts of their brain for learning and memory. These findings were similar for patients who gained recovery from their persistent post-concussion syndrome. The program will now be tailored for patients suffering from post-COVID neurological issues. A Harvard and Johns Hopkins trained neuroscientist, Dr. Fatuhi is widely regarded as an authority in the field of memory, Alzheimer's, concussion treatment, ADHD, and increasing brain vitality at any age. So that is, I think, really interesting, and it's something that just tells us one more reason why we're going to have to be careful about making assumptions about what we've seen with this virus. The one thing we've learned about this story is that this story changes depending on each and every day what happens. And the one thing I think that we really have to be careful for is assuming what is actually happening with this, because we learn all the time new information, which really makes us wonder where this is really causing the most problems. And we thought, at first we thought it was respiratory. Then we thought maybe it's cardiovascular. Now, it's autoimmune, it's neurological. And it's, of course, not an either or. That's one of the things I think is very important for people to be aware of here. But this is something that we really do need to be very aware of. And I'm going to share another piece here. I wasn't going to do this, but this is from the National Institute of Health. It's from June 11th, and it's about HIV. And I know we don't cover this, isn't AIDS Central or HIV Central, but I think it's interesting and it might be relevant because I've looked for guidance in my own studies about how HIV behaves, seeing the similarities in the genome between HIV and corona, to wonder how it's possible we could have spreading happening both in ways we don't expect, as well as in terms of a long-term output that I think we need to consider. And I say that in the sense that people who get this assume they get it and they're done with it. And we've had these sort of chronic questions out there that I think we really need to begin considering, and this is one of them. So let's take a look at this piece here I'm going to add in, and this ultimately comes from the National Institutes of Health. Brain cells can harbor and spread HIV virus to the body. Researchers have found that astrocytes, a type of brain cell that can harbor HIV and then spread virus to immune cells that traffic out of the brain and into other organs. HIV moved from the brain via this route even when the virus was suppressed by combination antiretroviral therapy. So that's, for those of you who don't recognize that, that's your remdesivirs, all those sort of antiviral drugs that are basically chaff. But if it's in the neurological system, a lot of times viruses, or I should say contagions in there, let's say it more broadly, can go ahead and be able to emerge from there and cause sort of damage. But this is what's interesting with HIV, that we're seeing that this happens. And I wonder if a similar model is not in fact happening in COVID, where our assumptions about what it means to be well, if it's in the brain, put it this way, if you do a nasal pharyngeal swab, which is what's being done, or potentially even if you're doing a blood antibody test, I mean, that would be better. But if you have it sitting only in neurological levels, where you have it sitting in some other source that the virus is basically waiting, you could maybe miss with tests how many people are sick and what risks they're incurring. So I think that's really important because we've seen this happen in other situations for other diseases here. But anyway, so let's see. The study, conducted by researchers at Rush University Medical Center in Chicago and published in PLOS Pathogens, was funded by the National Institutes of Health. This study demonstrates the critical role of the brain as a reservoir of HIV that is capable of reinfecting the peripheral organs with the virus. I mean, so what's that saying? It's saying if the brain, if it's in the neurological system, which is what these severe experiences have, it can come back into the body. And what can cause it to come back into the body? Well, stress, lack of support, or potentially other factors that are unknown to us. And those factors are things we need to understand because how many people have this is sort of an open question. The testing they have is not going to answer this question for us, and yet we do know that number is getting higher, and it's going to continue to get higher absent actions which are incredibly improbable at this point. Anyway, so this was said by Jamoyhan Joseph, PhD, chief of the HIV Neuropathogenesis, Genetics, and Therapeutics branch at the NIH National Institute of Mental Health, which co-funded the study. The findings suggest that in order to eradicate HIV from the body, cure strategies must address the role of the central nervous system. HIV attacks the immune system by infecting CD4 T cells, a type of white blood cell that is vital to fighting off infection. Without treatment, HIV destroys CD4 T cells, reducing the body's ability to mount an immune response, eventually resulting in AIDS, right? Acquired immune deficiency syndrome. So what's it saying is that the suppression of the immune system is how AIDS is actually successful in the long term. COVID could be doing this at the same time that it's piggybacking off of this. And that's why understanding the dysgenic immune response is so important, why we talk about it so often. CART, or we'll just call it CART, which effectively suppresses HIV infections, has helped many people with HIV live longer, healthier lives. But some studies have shown that many patients receiving antiretroviral drugs also show signs of HIV-associated neurocognitive disorders, such as thinking and memory problems. Researchers know that HIV enters the brain within 8 days of infection, but less is known about whether HIV-infected brain cells can release virus that can migrate from the brain back into the body to infect other tissues. And let me just insert one other point Big Pharma would never want to tell you, but that we've seen out there from someone who's been out there on the medical medical wilderness for a little while, which is that, and it's a logical thing. If you have a bacteria or virus and you create an environment within one part of your body that is not sympathetic to it, which is to say you take antiretrovirals that are going in there, or excuse me, retroantivirals, I said that backwards, that are going in there to try to limit and restrain this, the virus will look for a new neighborhood, and the neurological system would perhaps represent one that would be more friendly given the barriers between the blood-brain barrier, because the reason that barrier is so important is a lot of the killer cells don't go in there because they don't want to damage the delicate systems. So in a lot of ways, it's like moving into virgin land for diseases, and that's why neurological disorders can be so quick and disruptive in a lot of ways, because whereas, like I'll use the example of Lyme, where Lyme will feed on candida in someone's gut, when they go into the neurological system, they'll feed on the myelin sheath because they're looking for those fatty acids as proteins that are useful for its reproduction and for its long-term survival. And that's a bacteria, obviously, so it's a little different, but the basic logic holds the same, that if you can find a new place to go, you'll have a lot more effectiveness. And if you're threatening in one place and you see these big, complicated drugs, which I do freely admit have a lot of value to protecting life, but this is an arms contest, and you don't have to have a expectation that there's some untoward effort out there to try to prevent people who have HIV from worsening condition, to understand that a lot of times you are, in trying to solve problems, creating new problems. I mean, the number of side effects any medicine causes are considerable because the body really needs to heal itself to really get well. So the brain contains billions of astrocytes, which perform a variety of tasks from supporting communication between brain cells to maintaining the blood-brain barrier. To understand whether HIV can move from the brain to peripheral organs, Lena Alharthi, PhD, and her research team at Rush University Medical Center transplanted HIV-infected or non-infected human astrocytes into the brains of immunodeficient mice. The researchers found that the transplanted HIV-infected astrocytes were able to spread the virus to CD4 T cells in the brain. These CD4 T cells then migrated out of the brain and into the rest of the body, spreading the infection to peripheral organs such as the spleen and lymph nodes. They also found that when HIV egress from the brain occurred, albeit at lower levels, when animals were, or excuse me, I said this backwards. They also found that HIV egress from the brain occurred, albeit at lower levels, when animals were given CART. When CART treatment was interrupted, HIV DNA RNA became detectable in the spleen, indicating a rebound of the viral infection. So what they're saying is that it hides in the brain, and then it can kind of come out a little bit when there's some sort of treatment being given, the CART treatment that's happening. But and remember, that's combination antiretroviral therapy. So when they're given retrovirals, okay? So what ends up happening is that you have, the suppression, basically. It's like putting a plug in that system, but you're doing so that HIV is sort of gets in the brain, and it's just sitting there. So as they go on, our study demonstrates that HIV in the brain is not trapped in the brain. It can and does move back into peripheral organs through leukocyte trafficking, said Dr. Alharthi. It also shed light on the role of astrocytes in supporting HIV replication in the brain, even under this therapy. This information has significant implications for HIV cure strategies, and I would say for COVID as well, potentially, as such strategies need to be able to effectively target and eliminate reservoirs of HIV replication and reinfection, Dr. Alharthi added. HIV remains a major global public health concern, affecting 30 to 40 million people across the globe. To help patients, we need to fully understand how HIV affects the brain and other tissue-based reservoirs, said Mei Wong, PhD Program Director for NeuroAIDS and Infectious Diseases in the Neuroenvironment at the NIH National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke, which co-funded the study. Though additional studies that replicate these findings are needed, this study brings us another step closer toward that understanding. And that's in the PLS Pathogens Journal, and there's links here if you want to take a look at that in more depth. But I mention this because I think it's one of the things is, the question here is, how deeply neuroinvasive is this? Is this the reservoir where it's hiding? Are the tests missing it? And a theory that I have to have increasingly, based upon the knowledge I have of what our public response is that even with the social distancing, the masks, the cloths, all this stuff, none of that was going to work to keep people safe. In fact, it provided a degree of impairment, which was helpful in terms of preventing some of the viral spread. I'm not saying it had no value, but fundamentally it wasn't adequate to actually keep you safe. And now you see the question, how many people have this? How many people have it who aren't diagnosed as having it? And what does it mean for the longer term? And I think that's a question, because we really don't know what the manifestation of this is. And in the longer term, how it will respond to other viruses or other treatments. If we find a miracle cure that keeps us out of our system, right, that keeps us from getting the terrible, cardiological effects like the hypoxia, the hemorrhaging, but it just basically plugs it up in the brain, what's happening when COVID has nothing to do but work on our neurological system. And that's something we need to be afraid of, because now we have a lot of evidence that it's in there, it's doing things, and that there are real problems with it. So what's that mean for the long term? We don't know, but those are the questions we need to be asking, and we will do the best we can to cover this, despite the fact that it's going to be a difficult question. So let's look now in a little more depth at some of where people are getting these viruses and how bad it's ending up getting in areas. Now, this piece is from June 14th, which is yesterday, 10:47 a.m. I got this through Reuters by Lisa Schumacher. Record spikes in new coronavirus cases, hospitalizations sweep parts of the United States. New coronavirus cases and hospitalizations in record numbers swept through more U.S. states, including Florida and Texas, as most push ahead with the reopening, and President Donald Trump plans an indoor rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Alabama reported a record number of new cases for the fourth day in a row on Sunday. Alaska, Arizona, Arkansas, California, Florida, North Carolina, Oklahoma, and South Carolina all had record numbers of new cases in the past 3 days, according to a Reuters tally. Many state health officials partly attribute the increase to gatherings over the Memorial Day holiday weekend in late May. In Louisiana, which had been one of the earlier virus hotspots, new cases were again on the rise with over 1,200, the most there since May 21st. Nationally, there were over 25,000 new cases reported on Saturday, the highest tally for a Saturday since May 2nd, in part due to a significant increase in testing over the past 6 weeks. And obviously, if you test more, you're going to find more. But let's be honest, this is something we expected. The opening started around the end of May. It's now June 15th, so we're, 16, 17 days in from when the earliest one started. And we've talked about what the period is, how, the transmission rates work. And we said you probably were dealing with some 2 to 3 weeks, wait for it. People make fun of it. Here we are 2 to 3 weeks later, and suddenly, surprise, surprise, leads to effect. And people getting sick is it, so we'll see. Perhaps more troubling, though, for health officials, many of these states are also seeing record hospitalizations, a metric not affected by increased testings. Arkansas, North Carolina, Texas, and Utah had a record number of patients enter the hospital. In South Carolina, 69 to 77% of the hospital beds are occupied, depending on the region. And I'd love to hear in this story how many of those are COVID patients, how many of those are non-COVID patients. I think that's really an important piece so that we can understand what that's really saying, but we don't have that here. While Utah's governor announced last week that most counties there would pause their reopenings, most states are not considering a second shutdown as they face budget shortfalls and double-digit unemployment. Many went ahead with reopenings before meeting government infection rates for doing so. New York, the hardest-hit state, has utilized health guidelines to instruct its reopening and continue to see all measures of infection drop. New cases, deaths, hospitalizations, and positive rates among those who are getting tested. However, Governor Andrew Cuomo warned New York City and Long Island officials on Sunday that reopenings were at risk if they do not stop further large public gatherings that he said are threatening progress on curbing the spread of the coronavirus. Cuomo said the state has received 25,000 complaints recently of violations of social distancing and other emergency requirements, mostly in Manhattan and the Hamptons, affluent beach communities on the east end of Long Island. Yes, there is a very real possibility we would roll back the reopening in those areas, he said at a briefing. So I'll just tell you, I was in Buffalo 2 days ago. So I can talk about New York for 1 second there. And people were out doing things like normal, and they just were people were wearing masks, mostly. but some weren't, and it wasn't being enforced. And I'm not here to narc on anyone, because ultimately, how am I going to attack people when the governor, Cuomo, hasn't had a damn word to say about, some of the protests that happened in Brooklyn and other places, other than to encourage it. So if you're going to be a hypocrite, then people will be hypocrites, and that's how it is, and everyone's going to be a hypocrite about this. But that's where we're at, because you have to deal with the fact that there are other threats now that are out there. And it's a sad thing, because a lot of people are going to be at risk of being sick. And I'll make a prediction right now that's going to be pretty obvious, that I would expect in 2 to 3 weeks, you're going to see a spike in cases in New York and Pennsylvania, maybe less so in Massachusetts. I didn't see as many people milling about there. Massachusetts still has more closures, but they got hit later, and they're still slower in their reopen. But this is what's going to happen if you reopen. And I don't know what the solution is, because financially now you're at a spot where, having not done things the smart way and allowing this to percolate so much, I don't know if it's as simple as just writing people a check. I mean, I think that eventually there's going to be a push from Congress to maybe do this, and maybe that will happen if you start seeing people in these states that we've been talking about today, some of these right-leaning states. We're talking about Texas, Arizona, Florida, the Deep South, out there. Maybe there will be push for more stimulus, but the business sector is saying, no, you got to send people to work or we'll collapse unless you go ahead and give us more money. Now, they're getting more bonds coming in from the Fed, or rather Fed's securitization of the bond market is allowing that to happen. But ultimately, we're getting to the point where the running up of debt represents an existential threat to the dollar. And if the dollar collapses, our purchasing power goes away. And then your ability to buy goods and services are gone. And then other than what you can have in an area that you can trade and barter for, that literally might be all you can do. And I know that's a very dire prediction, and I'm not arguing that we're there, but we're on a trail that only really leads in one direction. And it's not that hard to understand that if you have nothing but the issuance of debt as currency, and you have no productive goods and services, the value of that currency will slacken. And that's what you're going to see in the dollar. So what I've been telling people, and I would tell every one of you in my audience, if there's something you want to buy, today's the day to buy it. Tomorrow's a good day too, but do not wait. Today's the day to lock down what you want to have, because I think that there's a very real risk to your ability to purchase things, especially if it's of a sort of good that either isn't made in the United States, isn't available locally, or is key infrastructure. If there's a tool, a saw, a generator, whatever it is, those are the sort of items I'm talking about. Because I think as you understand the economic situation as well as the viral situation, we reported Friday, I should say, last show, that the economic model that's being pushed in is going to be unsustainable. But that is even in the case of a one-wave infection. But you see here the evidence, which we expected, predicted, and have been reporting upon, that we are seeing, the resumption of the first wave. Although perhaps with more hospital stays being reported, maybe there is a substantive change happening, but we won't know that for a little while. It's something we would expect to be possible, and I would even go so far in my own calculations to say likely, and how I look at it, that we would see worse manifestations, because the opportunity that exists to utilize this virus for untoward means is very obvious. And look, the government's not going to say that because they don't want people to panic. The government lies to you because it doesn't trust you. That's been the way forever, and I think we all agree on that. We just disagree on what they lie about and why they lie, but fundamentally, that's just the truth. So here we go here. Fears that a second wave of infections is happening, or that states failed to curb their first wave, prompted health officials to plead with the public to wear masks to avoid large gatherings. Trump still plans to hold his first campaign rally since early March on Saturday in Tulsa, although those attending will have to agree to not hold the campaign responsible if they contract COVID. The odds are, quite frankly, and I will say for the president's purpose, this is very, very likely to go ahead and lead to more people getting COVID. But conversely, I'll tell you why he's doing it, because otherwise he doesn't get to offer a counter narrative to what the media is going to present, and his inability or unwillingness or incapacity to act, which is really a complicated story that involves the military, involves the state, and is kind of is actually the reason why I'm traveling right now. Is why you're going to see him doing that, because at this point the politicization of the virus is very real, and the politicization around it, where the virus is basically going to chop us all up. When you look at it, who wins? I mean, the answer is not America. I mean, whatever your belief is, ideology, whether you're concerned about social justice, economic survival, whatever it is. I mean, all of these destructive methods coming right on top of each other, and then we're going to fight a political campaign and perhaps a lot more over this. I mean, I personally think that this is going to get more accelerated. I was reading, I'm not going to talk about today, but, they toppled a statue of Thomas Jefferson in Portland, Oregon. And this is the guy who wrote the Declaration of Independence, being branded as someone who is a forbidden figure for at least some people up there. And when you get to that point, this is the place where things start getting weird historically. We're going to talk about that on Wednesday, but the pieces are out there if you want to take a look. You can find the video of that, by the way. It's out there. It's not hard to find these things, but this is why you're going to have people. And then in this piece, but this is what the media does, right? It's not fair because on the one hand, they'll go ahead and say, and this is why people on the right, to be honest with you, think the media is full of shit. And there's just no other way for me to put it than really express how they feel. Because on the one hand, well, you can't say this is bad because no, this is a more important issue, but your issues aren't important. You have to stay home. They can go out. And it's that hypocrisy that makes it impossible for people to get along. Whatever the set of rules are, they need to be fair for everybody. I said at the beginning we need to have a set of rules where everybody stayed home and everyone was taken care of. I went out of my way. I even said, look, and I'm known as a nationalist guy. And I said even what Governor Newsom did in California, taking care of illegals, people who were here, undocumented attendees, illegal aliens, whatever you want to call them, was necessary to deal with this. But now that we've gone away from that paradigm, we're stuck. And now we're in the old paradigm that doesn't work for the post-virus world. And so what's going to happen is that the virus is going to destroy that paradigm, but it's going to have a lot more damage along the way because they're going to fight over who gets to grab the pieces. And there needs to be a sane third way, but there can't be because we're going to be arguing over this because this is what the polarization permits. And even in my audience, I see it. I mean, I get people who are mad, and I've had to lose people and pick up people, but I can only tell you the story as I see it. It doesn't do you very good for me to tell you a fiction I don't believe in. And if that means that you have to adapt your opinions a little bit to understand it, well, so be it. But I have to tell you what I think is true. What is true is that Trump is getting those people sick, and he's doing so because he's making a political calculation, which is perhaps, I can't say whether that's worth it or not worth it, but the fact that they're saying that you have to sign a waiver to go to a political rally is a hell of a thing in America. About a third of record new cases in the state came from Tulsa County, according to state data. The Tulsa Health Department on Friday said the outbreak was linked to indoor gatherings, and this represents the air conditioning thing. Remember, ventilation was going to be a problem. It's very hot in those places, so you're seeing the reservoirs become the places where you could go indoors. Really something to keep an eye on. But I'm telling you that, and your response might be, let's not go to business, right? Which sounds fine, except then what happens? You're destroying the local businesses on the ground, and everything becomes direct, like Amazon. What happens when there's only one business or two businesses you can choose from, and that you don't have any sort of tax structure in your state? These are real problems, and we can't overlook them. Hospitalizations and the percent of tests coming back positive have been steady in the state. This is Oklahoma we're talking about. I have concerns about large groups of people gathering indoors for prolonged lengths of time. It is imperative that anyone who chooses to host or attend a gathering takes steps to stay safe, said Bruce Dart, department's executive director, in a statement that advised people at gatherings to wear masks. And they show a picture of people, in a reopening phase gathering outside a bar in New York City. And you can see, just in this picture, in this article, there's about 25, 30 people outside. Some are wearing masks, some aren't. But if one of those people is sick, every one of them has it right now. So, that's what we got here. And we'll do another piece here on this, just to add some more color to what we're talking about, what's happening. This piece is from, it looks like, we got this from MSN.com, and it looks like that's the Boston Globe, which is coming from, that's basically the New York Times. All right, coronavirus cases spike across Sunbelt as economy lurches into motion. This is from Julie Bosman, also from yesterday. Chicago. The warning has echoed ominously for weeks from epidemiologists, small-town mayors, and county health officials. Once states begin to reopen, a surge in coronavirus cases will follow. That scenario is now playing out in states across the country, particularly in the Sun Belt and the West, as thousands of Americans have been sickened by the virus in new and alarming outbreaks. Hospitals in Arizona have been urged to activate emergency plans to cope with a flood of coronavirus patients. On Saturday, Florida saw its largest single-day count of cases since the pandemic began. Oregon has failed to contain the spread of virus in many places, leading the governor Thursday to pause what had been a gradual reopening. And in Texas, cases are swiftly rising around the largest cities, including Houston, San Antonio, and Dallas. Before we get into that, remember, let me just put a date in your mind. At the end of July, the unemployment assurance that is out there that was provided for in the CARES Act that's providing the extra $600 a month will expire, and a lot of people will lose the ability to survive. So, who can't work right now. Will Congress reauthorize this between now and then? And that is one of the questions you very much need to keep an eye on, because if you don't, and you take a bunch of people and feed them into what by then may be an inferno of a shredder of both social unrest as well as the risks of the virus, people are going to be very unhappy, and that this would exacerbate and accelerate tensions and add new angry mobs to the mix. But that is something they need to be aware of, and this is why I say bad policy in the beginning leads to bad policy in the end. I'm just hinting at you. This is what you're looking at 6 weeks from now. You're looking at the fact that you're going to have either the continuation of a second shutdown that somehow happened to stop the wave we're going to see begin cresting here in the next week or two of new cases that are going to emerge, or we're going to have an out-of-control situation that looks a little bit like Brazil, where destabilization of the country is on the table. I'll try to cover them a little more on Friday, because things have not gotten better down there, but I can't give you the details in the amount you would need to understand it right now, because I haven't had the chance to do as much research, but it does look really bad down there. And I'm concerned about this, said Mayor Eric Johnson of Dallas, noting that after months of warnings and isolation, many residents had stopped wearing masks and maintaining social distance out of sheer fatigue. They've been asked for quite some time to not be around people they love and that they want to spend time with. Wearing a mask is not pleasant, and I think that people are tired. For close to a month, much of the United States has looked like a nation open or beginning to open and increasingly unfettered by restrictions meant to slow the spread of the coronavirus. With many government limits removed and people left to make individual choices about precautions, Americans have gone back to salons and restaurants, crowded into public parks, and in dozens of cities joined large public demonstrations protesting police misconduct. Overall, daily coronavirus cases across the United States are essentially steady, stuck on a plateau. More than 2 million people have now contracted this virus in this country, according to the New York Times database, and every day about 21,100 new known cases are reported, not much lower than the numbers from a month ago. About 800 people die from it each day. Those figures have both dropped significantly since peaking in April. But as of Saturday, the daily number of new coronavirus cases was climbing in 22 states, shifting course from what had been downward trajectories in many of those places. The spikes in cases bring leaders in these states to a new crossroads. Accept the continued rise in infections as an expected cost of reopening economies, or consider slowing the lifting of restrictions aimed at stopping the spread or even imposing a new set of limits. In Houston on Thursday, the county's top elected official warned that the community was on the precipice of a disaster and urged residents to minimize contact with others. More than 300 new cases have been identified in that county on each recent weekday. But at the city's Galleria Mall, there were few signs of concerns. People stood in a tightly spaced line for pretzels at an Auntie Anne's kiosk. At California Nails, 2 women sat maskless during pedicures. Signs urged social distancing, but in crowded walkways outside doors, shoppers brushed past one another, only inches apart. And so, the thing about it, though, and here's the piece that I can't ignore, is that the media is telling you, they're talking out both sides of their mouth, right? They were saying here, look, this is bad and you need to do this. And I thought we were all on board with that. But 2 weeks ago, they decided that they wanted to tell a different story, and they did this. So when you want to know who the bad guys are, I'm looking at you, the editors of the New York Times, all these publications that said, no, you can't go ahead and say that you can't fight these things, because ultimately what happened was a terrible act was committed by a cop that shouldn't have happened, where he was charged with murder for it. What more can you ask for from a fair system? And yet we decided to make it into a national riot. Why? Because something deeper and darker was behind it. And we're going to talk about that, and that's fine. I understand there are a lot of legitimate people who are angry and protesting, upset, but I'm going to tell you this isn't what it looks like. It really isn't what it looks like. And in the course of the next few months, you'll come to understand that this was part of a deliberate effort as some asymmetrical war to destabilize the United States of America. And in that situation, who will be the biggest victims? Probably the very urban poor who are out there demonstrating right now. But that's fine. That's what we're dealing with. And this is one of the things about this show. You have to deal with different risks. And, on the one hand, it's like this. Honestly, this is how I feel about it. And this is one of the reasons why I'm traveling. On the one hand, there's a virus outside that will get you sick. On the other hand, there's a man behind you holding a gun to your head, say, go out or I'll shoot you. You got to go out and take certain chances at that point if that's the risk you face. And for every one of us, it's a little different. If you are just staying apart and staying home, that's fine. I have no problem with that. But there are these other issues, and we have to talk about them all for us to meet the utility of this sort of odd show that has evolved, where we talk about safety, because we don't see safety, and you don't see it here in Texas. Let's go to another state. Throughout most of Florida, the reopening of public life has allowed bars and movie theaters to operate at half capacity and gyms at full capacity. On June 5th, the state loosened restrictions further, even as the caseload was beginning to go up. And I will tell you, Republican governors will not be permitted to put in more restrictions. So that's not happening. That ship has sailed. Democratic states might go along with it for certain reasons, although the Republicans in those states are not going to, because of how this was handled. And this is what I said, bad policy leads to bad policy, and the lack of unity is the story in this case. In Salt Lake City, some people are now behaving as they did before the coronavirus pandemic, even amid a rise in cases, said Teresa Keel, Utah resident who runs summer soccer camps with her husband. We went to a restaurant the other night and none of the employees had masks on, Keel said. It was kind of shocking. Dr. Angela Dunn, the Utah state epidemiologist, has traced the state's resurgence to coronavirus to the state reopenings, which began before Memorial Day. The timing directly correlates with our loosening up of restrictions, Dunn said. That definitely has something to do with it. And it makes sense that it would. I mean, the virus does not care about what we want. It looks at us like food. I don't know how else to say it. There is ample reason to tie the latest surge of infections to relatively early reopenings. Cluster of infections in food processing facilities, jails, and nursing homes continue to create hotspots in some places, but they do not explain the broader pattern. Most of the 10 hardest hit states that have seen rising case levels started reopening on or before May 8th. Louisiana, where cases have started rising again after extended declines, began reopening on May 15th. Another hard-hit state with growing cases, California, has reopened in a more incremental way, with continuing restrictions in some regions. Many states that were slowest to reopen have seen a different trajectory, at least so far. Most of the 10 states hit hard overall in the pandemic, but currently seeing decreasing daily cases of the virus, began reopening in mid-May or later. Only 2 of those states, Pennsylvania and Indiana, began reopening before May 15th. Some of the others, New Jersey and Michigan, only began reopening in earnest in June. And 2 others, New York and Illinois, kept restrictions in their worst-hit areas while reopening less populous regions. As testing capacity has increased, so has the number of cases being counted. And officials in places like Arizona and Florida say the increase in cases may be explained partly by the growing availability of tests. And I think that's fair. You find what you're looking for. And I will say there are going to be people who are going to go out and say, this is what it is. It's a virus that doesn't hurt anybody. That we're getting more tests to scare you into staying home because they don't want you to have an economy. And I can tell you people are going to say that. I don't actually think it's as simple as that, but it doesn't really matter what I think necessarily. It's what people are going to argue, and I guarantee you that argument is coming because it makes sense to a lot of people in light of what they're seeing without understanding the full depth of this virus, which hasn't been properly expressed by any major public entity, including the CDC. I mean, the role of the CDC in giving inadequate and inaccurate guidelines, the World Health Organization, in giving contradictory reports, is really unsettling in all of this. And when it's all done and we look at the institutional actors, we are going to have to ask a lot of questions, whoever's on the other side of this, to ask their complicity in creating such a terrible risk for our population. So, Dr. Anthony S. Fauci, country's top infectious disease experts, said on Friday in an interview with ABC News it was important to look at both case numbers and the percentage of positive tests to understand whether upticks in cases reflected broader transmission in American cities. If you test more, you will likely pick up more infections, Fauci said. He added, once you see that the percentage is higher, then you've really got to be careful because then you are seeing additional infections you weren't seeing before. And I will say the politicization of Dr. Fauci is something that has become present and inevitable. There are a number of stories about roles that he played in suppressing certain information about the AIDS epidemic out there that people have different opinions on, but that difference in opinion is one of the issues, as well as the fact that, some of the things that he has gone out there and done in his leadership in the National Institute of Health, that they funded the Wuhan laboratory to the tune of several $1 million, makes him an actor that has a weird role in this story. And I'm saying this not because I'm saying he is guilty or not guilty of anything. his proponents would say that he funded that to try to prevent the sort of dangerous happenings, research in China from being done unsafely. The detractors will say there was research that we didn't want to have to be done in the United States about gain of function. The government said no, so the National Institute of Health funneled money to China to do this because they had some other desire, whether it be research they wanted to see done or whether it was something more dark and sinister. I have no idea, but I will tell you that information being in the public sphere, just one more example how you can't listen to an epidemiologist who people are going to consider not being above board. And I'm not saying he is or isn't. I'm not making a judgment. I'm simply saying that people are going to make judgments, and the fact that that has become an issue makes that harder because you have people at the top who are going to be considered that there's no trusted authority, and that's one of the reasons why we will have an inability to go ahead and stop and put things back and put the genie back in the bottle about how we want to fight this. That ship has sailed. But epidemiologists said that even taking into account a rise in testing, the increase in confirmed cases in Sunbelt states suggested increased transmission. Other measures, such as the percentage of positive tests and hospitalizations, reflect that worsening outlook. In Florida, more than 4.5% of those tested between the 31st of May and June 6th had the virus, compared with about 2.3% of people who saw tests in mid-May. Earlier in the pandemic, the percentage of people testing positive in Florida was higher, but that was during a period when testing was far more limited. Similar rates in Arizona and Texas have also risen in recent weeks. In Arizona, more than 1,400 people who were believed to have had the virus were hospitalized Friday, up from 755 a month earlier, and higher than at any other point in the pandemic. In Texas, the 2,166 coronavirus patients hospitalized Friday were the most yet in that state. For states with growing coronavirus outbreaks, some officials have arrived at the same conclusion. The rise in infections is unfortunate but inevitable. We're not going to be able to stop the spread, said Dr. Kara Christ, Arizona State Health Director. Excuse me. And so we can't stop living as well. In Florida, the number of new coronavirus cases has topped 1,000 for all but one of the past 7 days. Most of the state began to reopen May 4th, though South Florida is still under tighter restrictions. Miami Beach is only reopened Wednesday. Despite the uptick in cases in some states, there are also states that have been reported for reopened for weeks where the number of new known virus cases has slowed. Pennsylvania, Indiana, and Colorado, all which began opening in late April or early May have seen hopeful signs. It is possible the full effect of reopening may be hidden from view. Certain states and counties are testing less than others, and reopening has looked different in different places depending partly on the varying habits of their residents. And I will say that I'm just making a guess. I don't know this, but I've been to most of these places. I grew up in the Southwest, spent a lot of time in the South, and I know Northeast. It might be as simple as this. It might be air conditioners are the easiest way to spread it. We saw that early. It was a problem in Wuhan. We reported on that. It was an issue in Japan as well, that air circulation in a cold, controlled environment was a place the virus could spread. Maybe it could be as simple as, you going down to, Ralph's or the H-E-B and, all these supermarkets, and they could be the spot where everyone's getting this, not because it's being spread person to person, but it's surviving better in a cold environment because you just need one person to get it in there. And if you don't have adequate measures, it'd be very hard to keep it out despite different actions happening if it's in the ventilation system, depending on how long and how much it spreads. Do I know that? No. But it's an argument that might fit the evidence. So, and we'll just talk about this because one of the things I really want to make clear as we go through this, and I'm not really trying to, today at least, cast aspersions on anyone acting. I just want you to understand the consequences of the actions that are happening here. I'm going to take, in the interest of fairness, I'm going to try to take a right-wing view of what's happening with coronavirus with respect to intersecting the protest and left-wing view of it. We'll take a couple quick looks at some little pieces that are coming out of this that might be important about why we're not going to be able to shut down very easily. From a left-wing state, I'm going to look from Massachusetts since I spent some time up there and now I have a better feel for what's happening. But this is an editorial here that was published on June 13th from the New York Post, which tends to lean a little right of center. I think that's fair. But it says, protesters need to own up to the coronavirus risks they're imposing on everyone. When the city finally entered phase 1 of the restart last week, Governor Andrew Cuomo cheered. New Yorkers bent the curve by being smart, but not all of us are being prudent. and it could set everyone back. Fact is, the city is struggling to return to life, with restaurants as yet unable to offer outdoor dining, most retail shops barred from letting customers, and countless cultural institutions closed completely. And some stores ruined by looters may never reopen. Meanwhile, Dr. Deborah Birx warns of another cause for concern. The protests after the police killing of George Floyd could bring a sharp rise in COVID cases, and I would expect another thing, what happened in Atlanta this weekend, the big outcry that happened there, the burning of the Wendy's, will be just one more example of that. We'll get into that case another time. I don't want to cover that today. New York is seeing such protests continue daily, an added burden that complicates reopening. In a phone call with governors last week, Birx noted that most major metropolitan areas saw a significant drop in new coronavirus cases in May and early June, but the protests may derail that positive trajectory. Many in the huge, not socially distanced crowds wore no masks, she explained, and shouting, as demonstrators tend to do, likely makes masks less effective. Several known super spreader events involve choral singing. Chanting at the top of your lungs is surely bad, too. Meanwhile, mayhem around the protests destroyed some 70 testing sites in various cities, largely in the communities hardest hit by the virus. Some progressive public health experts justify the protests on the grounds that institutional racism inflicts health harms on minorities, yet these demonstrations will give themselves these demonstrations will themselves give the virus a boost in mainly minority communities. Overall, Harvard Global Health Institute chief Ashish Jha warns the combination of protests and people congregating in public places while we await a vaccine could double the nation's death toll, now around 112,000 by September. That's not worth the risk, not when the data from states ahead of us in reopening shows some mixed results. Georgia seems to be doing great. Its numbers still flat, though salons and gyms have been open for a month and a half. Arizona, by contrast, is heading toward 100% ICU occupancy. Far too much about the virus remains unknown, even as lockdowns rightly end because the economy and much of the public just can't take it anymore. But we know what activities are highest risk. Everyone still protesting should set aside their moral fervor for a moment and figure out how to minimize those risks. Okay. And we'll grab another piece from this because we're going to go back to New York and one thing, but I want to do both sides of this. So this is from Vox, which I think would represent definitely a counterpoint to New York Post. This was written by Brian Resnick on June 11th. 5 reasons the pandemic is so very far from over. No matter what else happens, the coronavirus isn't going away. The United States may be seeing the beginning of a new wave of COVID cases. 14 states and Puerto Rico have hit new 7-day average highs of new coronavirus infections, the Washington Post reports. Some of that may be due to new increased testing. The more testing that's done, the more cases are found. But Arizona in particular is on high alert. If ICU beds are filling up, then the state's health detectors told hospitals to start activating their emergency plans. At The Atlantic, Robinson, Meyer, and Alexis Madrigal argue it looks like the U.S. is already giving up on public health measures. We read that article last week. The White House Coronavirus Task Force is barely meeting anymore. People are crowded together again in indoor casinos. Also, the mass protests against police brutality and for racial justice could spread the virus further. Many protesters know the risks and have thoughtful reasons for participating anyway. Police have acted as though a pandemic isn't happening, forcing crowds into confined spaces, tear gassing them, and jailing protesters in cramped cells. So you can see here that, I just want to grab this paragraph because I have to show it to you, that literally what they're saying is these guys are going out there for a noble and heroic reason, so they're taking the virus into risk and overwhelming it, and the police is attacking them, making sure that they suffer, and they want them to get the virus and die. This is what happens, and look, both sides do it. I'm not saying it. The other side will be like, we're here fighting for our freedoms, and we're going to go ahead and overcome this at any consequence. It's the same story, but ultimately the virus does not give a damn about our ideologies, and that's one of the points I had to say. The problem is because we give more care about our ideologies than our safety, we now have to fight a battle about this, and we're going to because neither side's going to back down, and whether you want to or not, you may find yourself drawn into it, if only because the damage it's going to wreak and exacerbate to our economy, to our social construct, and it's going to make it impossible for Congress to help people. So what's going to happen is the economy is going to get worse because realistically, people can't do the things they used to do when they're getting sick, yet we're going to ask them to do so anyways. So the chaos in America is only going to increase. Let's continue. It's much too soon to give up. The dangerousness of this virus, of this pandemic, hasn't changed. No matter what happens in the news over the next weeks and months, this will still be true. The situation is not fundamentally all that different than 6 months ago, said Sarah Kobe, an infectious disease modeler at the University of Chicago. We still have a highly transmissible virus, and the vast majority of the population remains susceptible to it. The situation is arguably even worse now, since the virus is so much more widespread than it was a few months ago. Plus, now as states relax social distancing policies, more people risk being exposed. Here's what everyone needs to know about why the pandemic isn't going away and why we can't give up fighting it. Number one, opening up the economy exposes more people to the coronavirus. Back in February, public health experts were worried about outbreaks igniting from overseas travelers abroad returning to the United States. Now those sparks are everywhere in the United States. If the coronavirus is a wildfire, then we humans are the trees, the fuel. In March and in April, when most of the country was under some form of stay-at-home or lockdown order, most of us trees, except essential workers, were spread far apart from one another. Now that states are allowing people to put themselves in closer proximity to others, the fire can more easily jump from person to person. Number two, we're nowhere near the threshold for herd immunity. Most people can still get infected. For the pandemic to simmer down naturally in a way that will allow life to go back to normal, the population needs to achieve something called herd immunity. For the coronavirus, herd immunity could possibly be achieved when 50% of the population is immune, but it could be as high as 65%. But no area is nowhere near that figure. And that might not be true, by the way. That's a really optimistic assumption. I don't know where they're getting that number from. The numbers I've read are far closer to 80. That's a junk number. But no area is anywhere near that figure, even in New York City, where at least 17,000 people have died of COVID. In late April, it was estimated that 20% of the city had been exposed to the coronavirus. Elsewhere, the infection rates are much, much lower. There's no evidence that there's some big accumulation of immunity in the population. Natalie Dean, biostatistician at the University of Florida, says, especially places that have avoided a big COVID wave so far, there's plenty more fuel for this fire. Herd immunity cannot be achieved without a massive amount of pain and death. 50% of the United States infected means 160 million infections. 1 in 200 of those could result in death. That's 800,000 deaths. We've already seen an enormity of pain and death, but an even greater number of pain and death are possible. And that's the amount of people who die in a major war, by the way, to give you a feel for just how traumatic that is and to a country. In that's like a World War, almost like a World War II type number. It's probably higher actually than what the U.S. experienced. I don't know the number off the top of my head. Take a look here. So just to put it in perspective, because I wanted to see the number, the Washington Post says 405,000 people, Americans, died in World War II. So we're looking at a death toll that's double what was experienced in World War II from this, theoretically. And of course, disease is part of life. We understand that. And many of these people did have pre-existing conditions and say, were they going to die anyway? Well, we don't really know that, but we know a number of people who are dying aren't in that position. And the fact that we're just overlooking this, I think eventually someone's going to realize this is important. And the fact that people get bored with it doesn't make it go away. It makes everything just more complicated. And I'm not going to get bored with it because we need to keep talking about this. In May, a team of Harvard scientists modeled how long it would take to achieve herd immunity in the U.S. if the country was cautious and avoided overwhelming the hospital system. Prolonged or intermittent social distancing may be necessary into 2022, they concluded. Number 3, we don't have to choose between endless lockdowns and mass deaths. There are other ways to manage the pandemic. Herd immunity is not the only way for the pandemic to end. We can manage to spread and contain it to small clusters with an aggressive system of testing and tracing the contacts of the infected. All right, so let's insert one thing here. One of the things is, I'm going to tell you, this isn't even going to be possible because at this point, no one's going to be okay with social contacting. And I'm going to tell you why. Because we don't trust the actors. You think dissidents are going to trust the state, or you think that, on the other hand, people who live in rural areas are going to trust, governors who were hypocrites? That's all gone. Contract tracing's out the window. Not that people may not try to do it, but fundamentally they're not going to comply. Just want to put that out there. This was a decision everyone made together. This work is made difficult by the fact people can spread the virus before they know they're sick. The virus is sneaky. We have so many infections that are undetected, Dean says. That will make it hard to contain. But that challenge couldn't be addressed. We've seen clear examples of how transmission appears to be controllable with widespread testing and physical distancing, including mask wearing, Kobe says. Look at South Korea, for example. If most people on the planet could take those precautions, perhaps the virus would go away. In the absence of test and trace deployments, we can all do our best to try to reduce chances of spreading the coronavirus to others. by wearing masks, maintaining distancing between people, avoiding crowds indoors, among other suggestions, to reduce harm while rejoining society in a limited capacity. Number 4, this virus could lull us into a false sense of security. It takes an average day of 5 days for a person to show symptoms after being infected with COVID, but it can take up to 14. And after infection, it takes time to get tested and time for the results to come back. Some people won't get tested, and their cases will only be noted when they arrive at a hospital. A person can be contagious for a day or two before they begin feeling symptoms or never develop symptoms at all, and may remain contagious until several days after the symptoms end. That means by the time new cases start to appear in the data, a new wave of infections is already well underway. Let's not get complacent. The increase in cases in some communities now is the result of changes that began several weeks ago. And number 5, a vaccine can end the pandemic, but not immediately. And I want to be very clear here. I don't necessarily think a vaccine is going to work for this for a lot of reasons we've well discussed. There's not yet a vaccine to prevent SARS-2 from infecting people, but even if there is a vaccine to inoculate people against the coronavirus, the pandemic won't immediately end. It may not be perfectly effective, and there may not be enough of it. Let's not lose sight of how it will take an enormous effort to end the pandemic. Humans have only eradicated 2 diseases via vaccine, smallpox and cattle disease called rinderpest, and in both cases, it was a result of an enormous global effort. Don't imagine eradicating the virus will be any easier. We're in for a long haul, unfortunately, but that doesn't mean we should give up. These new infections aren't a surprise. Epidemiologists warned us that reopening could quickly backfire. When we let up on precautions while putting new ones in place, like a national test, trace, and isolation effort, and universal masking, the virus will find lots of new people to infect. The models told us this, too. The places most at risk for a second wave are places that largely avoided the first one, such as Arizona, and didn't prepare well for a second. These places have populations that are almost entirely susceptible to infection, removing the most powerful thing protecting them, social distancing. Without new protections in place, just leaves them exposed. And social distancing, really, this is the one thing I don't really love. The social distancing that was set up was doomed to fail because it didn't really consider the virology right. And, that was a choice, but it's done because we wanted to have it both ways. And to this whole story, that's what the U.S. does, man. We want to continue our politics as usual. We want to continue our economy as usual. We want to have low intensity sort of measures. And, people will laugh at you, even now. When I was out, Ed, people tell me, you don't need to be wearing a mask anymore. I'm like, and I just waved. I didn't want to have an argument with people. I really didn't. But ultimately, they are following the directions of others, and you have the blind leading the blind. Don't be blind. Have your eyes open. Even if your retinas get burned out by the brightness, at least you'll have given yourself a chance to survive, because you got to stare into the abyss sometimes. That's how it is. That was a terrible mixed metaphor, wasn't it? The pandemic is still just beginning. Sigh if you need to. Screaming helps too, just not in an enclosed place with other people around, but we can't give up now. And I agree with that part of it, the sad thing to me, I will say this, a little editorial here, is that there was a short moment where we could have come together as one people to deal with this, and our politicians and our finance people guaranteed that would not happen. I want you to remember that. And what did they do? They did it because those were the people, and I blame the finance people in the end, because the finance people write the checks the politicians listen to. Not that the politicians couldn't have been better, but they weren't. And they weren't on either side. The right wasn't better because they wanted to get back to work immediately so they can go back to their favorite game of making money. And the left wasn't any better because the minute someone said social justice, everyone's brains went straight up their backsides, and they weren't able to go ahead and say that, literally they would rather let people jump off a bridge rather than say, if you're judging me, you're racist. And that's the truth of it. That's what actually ended up happening. And what's interesting is that the media in both cases played cheerleader to lead these destructive tendencies, having to know on some level, because I've met enough old crusty editors over the years to know that they knew what they were doing. So why is this happening to us? What is being done? Who is leading us toward, are the Pied Pipers leading us toward our destruction? I think we need to ask those questions. So let me read a couple pieces here real fast. We're going to add just some quick little color to this that I think will be helpful for understanding what we have here. And this piece is from the Los Angeles Times, June 13th, Kate Linthicum, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. New Yorkers survived the coronavirus, but will they stay for what comes next? And this will just give you a quick glimpse into the future in front of us, right? We'll have 3 quick pieces. This one's a little longer, but it's worth it. All right. Brent Teed stood by himself Wednesday morning in the cavernous main hall of Grand Central Station, tossing his hat into the air with one hand and catching it with the other. As an usher for the Metro-North commuter rail line, he is used to being jostled, yelled at, and badgered for directions by many of the roughly 750,000 transit riders who rush through the station on a normal day. But the coronavirus outbreak had turned Grand Central into a ghost town, its famed celestial ceiling looming over just a handful of masked riders and 2 National Guard troops stationed in front of a shuttered ticket booth. New York City was missing its people, and Teed wasn't sure whether they would all come back. Life here has always been a grind, a trade-off in which space and privacy are sacrificed for endless cultural offerings, food from all over the map, and the feeling that you're in the center of it all in the bright beating heart of the universe. But as New York began the first phase of its reopening this week and residents cautiously began to emerge from lockdown, they found a changed city. Key drivers of the economy, Broadway, museums, and many hotels, shops, and restaurants remain closed. Subways and buses are still largely empty, bereft of office workers, students, and tourists. In neighborhoods where Black Lives Matter protests have been occurring daily, stores remain boarded up to protect from break-ins. Many of the city's wealthiest residents left long ago for their country estates. Now the less fortunate are contemplating whether there's still a place for them here. The virus has already killed more than 17,000 New Yorkers, and Teed wonders what will happen if it surges again. He wonders whether some jobs may be lost forever and if it makes sense to pay New York City rent when you can't access New York City perks. "You're telling me I can't go to a bar or a show or a ball game? Come on, man," said Teed, whose railroad used to ferry 300,000 people in from the suburbs each day, but this week just had a daily ridership of 20,000. Teed has lived in the city 8 years and had planned to stay at least 2 more in order to be vested for a pension before returning to his native Buffalo. But the coronavirus, which killed people he knew, convinced him to call it quits sooner. He plans to move home in July. New York hasn't changed entirely. It's still a magical meeting point for people from every part of the planet. Go to one of the thousands of the bodegas, and you might still hear an old woman who was born in Russia barking orders more butter to a young man behind the counter who was born in Mexico, while a customer born in Vietnam orders his bagel, Spanish, and Spanglish, "El bacon crispy, por favor." You'll still hear people talking loudly on the phone, oblivious to those around them. "I wore the mask, right? But this guy was sneezing a lot. Now what could that mean?" But there is fear, too. A statewide moratorium on evictions has been in place since March, but renters were expected to pay back rent once it expires on August 20th. Soup kitchens say they are now feeding not just homeless people, but also graduate students and down on their luck to actors. Lency Lacona, a 40-year-old construction worker from Honduras, said a prayer Monday morning when he stepped aboard a Manhattan-bound train. Construction and manufacturing were officially reopened, and Lacona, who spent 3 months holed up in his cramped Bronx apartment while watching bills pile up and his bank balance dwindle, was thankful to be back on the job. But the subway, thought to be a major vector for the virus, scared him. "People are so stressed out," he said. "That's the truth. We're all afraid." In Times Square, street vendors who used to hawk knickknacks to tourists now sell Black Lives Matter T-shirts and face masks. Corporate advertising has shifted to messaging about the coronavirus and national race relations. A towering digital billboard flashes a message from Samsung: "We'll all get through this together." But some here wonder, will we? And I will say, the thing about it is you have corporations and media saying certain things are there, but as you see, and mind you, this is the confluence of the virus and the protests, and mind you, they work together to really make things seem bad. You see 1/15 of the traffic coming into New York City. So let's just think for 1 second, what does that mean? That means that you've lost 92% about of your economic activity is gone. You can't keep afloat with that. Now, mind you, a lot of that happens on computers and happens through telehealth, but for the people at the bottom, ironically, they're the ones who are getting screwed by the things they're being encouraged to do, and they're not going to get less angry. They're going to get more angry, and the efforts at destabilization, where, I've seen the people in Brooklyn, actually, I watched them say, revolution is the only solution. So let's be honest. Let's take them at their word. That's what they want. We are dealing with something like this, and that is happening where the virus is being used as the means of destabilization, and they're just building off of it. And a lot of people are appropriate. So for all the stories you read about them saying how extremists and white supremacists are using the virus to advance their agenda, the reality, as often is the case, the media is the exact opposite, that's what you're seeing. And the media itself is the cheerleader who's trying to encourage this because they want to create a very different world at the risk to the health of the many people, the 17 million people, for instance, who previously lived in the New York City metropolitan area, and many of which have headed to other places. I swear for all my little travels, I saw more out-of-state plates in my little town, Greenville, Maine, than I saw, population 1,600, versus what I've seen traveling all around the Northeast this week. So just keep that in mind. New York has bounced back from harrowing events before. Less than 20 years ago, it was the main target in the worst ever foreign attack on American soil. But 9/11 and the destruction of the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center were a single event that served to unify much of the city. The coronavirus is different. It demands people keep their distance from one another, and it has helped fuel a passionate civil rights movement that has in some ways divided the city. Protests here over the death of George Floyd, an unarmed black man in police custody in Minneapolis, have left some New Yorkers feeling conflicted. Lily Ing, 36, who runs a vegan grocery store on the edge of Chinatown, said she has many black customers and is sympathetic to protester demands. But she also has police officers in her family and feels uncomfortable with calls to defund the New York PD. So she tries to avoid the topic entirely. And I was seeing in the budget in New York, actually, they're going to take $1 billion out of the police budget. So do you think businesses will want to locate there? You know, some of you may have seen that Minneapolis has a lot of properties for sale. Wonder why, right? The demonstrations taking place here, like similar actions across the nation, are raw and often painful. At a recent event in Lower Manhattan, family members of more than a dozen victims of police shootings shared their stories, their voices bouncing off the limestone walls of city halls. Hundreds of protesters stood listening in the 87-degree heat for 2 hours before beginning the march. As they turned north on Broadway, passing boarded-up Lululemon and Prada stores, maybe that's Lululemon. I don't know what's fashionable. Many drivers who were forced to stop honked their horns and raised their fists in support. One woman turned off her car and climbed up through her sunroof to raise a Black Lives Matter sign. Yannick Stevens was overwhelmed. A florist from the Caribbean island of St. Kitts who moved to New York 3 years ago, he said he never knew how long he would last in the city, in part because the national political climate made him, a queer black man, feel unwelcome. But the protests, which at time had a hopeful, even festival-like quality. This is interesting. The media refers to everything as a hopeful festival thing. Even the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone in Seattle, right? Literally, where they've declared, and I'm not even kidding, you can look this up, people are surrendering their citizenship to say they're part of something new. But hey, what can you do? The media tells a story. Every out-of-work young person he knew had become a full-time organizer for change. Maybe there is a future here for people like me, he said. And maybe this is it. Maybe this is what we see. This is the division. Cities are going to go one way and the countryside's going to go the other, and maybe it'll be peaceful. Who knows? Maybe that's for the best. We'll see what happens. Life is less changed in the city's 4 outer boroughs, where residents linger on their stoops late into the night, playing dice and drinking beer as the summer's first fireflies light up the sky. But the island of Manhattan, which has always been a commuter mecca, it's quieter than it's ever been. I never thought I'd miss tourists, but I do, said Michael Brogan, 68, former Broadway performer who lives in the Hell's Kitchen neighborhood, a normally bustling zone. During lockdown, loneliness set in. I would start drinking at 3 or 4 p.m. and then watch or stream things until 3 or 4 in the morning, he said, and then I'd repeat. For one of the first times since the pandemic took hold here, he got on the subway on a recent afternoon, taking the E train to Washington Square. The subway was cleaner than he'd ever seen in his 50 years living in New York, thanks to overnight disinfections the city has implemented to fight the virus. He strolled to one of the city's oldest gay bars, Julius's, which has been serving drinks to customers who order from the sidewalk. Make it extra strong, he implored the bartender, Aiden Garcia. He didn't have to say what he wanted. Garcia knows his drink is a gin and a soda. In nearby Christopher Street Park, Brogan says hello to Simone McKay, a drag performer who has been giving impromptu performances there. We all feel like we've been in the Twilight Zone, like a nuclear bomb had hit the city, McKay said. People miss their lives, they want their lives back. While Brogan moved on to talk to someone else, McKay turned back to her friend Michael Strachan and complained why the lockdown had been so difficult. I was trapped in an apartment with someone I hate, she said. That's a hell of a time for you to realize you hate somebody, Strachan said. A third-generation New Yorker, Strachan, 62, has survived cancer and HIV. He was sick with COVID and survived it too. He said New York City will do the same. The city has survived the Civil War and the pandemic of 1918, he said. It survived stock market crashes, World War II, blackouts, several financial crises, and 9/11. We've survived more than any other city in the country, and we're still standing. And I will say, if you really want to know here, and I one piece of advice, by the way, pro information, it's always worth reading the comments after a story like this. If you read the story, you would see a bevy of stories and testimonies of people who are leaving New York or getting out saying, I don't want to be in a state that's unsafe. I can't do what I want economically. The police aren't going to protect me, and riots are running around the cities. And mind you, does that reflect everyone's views? No, it doesn't. But it reflects a lot of views, and if you take half the people one direction and half the other people the other direction, what happens? You end up fighting, and that's why people are going around despite COVID, because we are not united against a common enemy. We are dealing with each other as more pressing enemies rather than dealing with the virus as the more important one. And like I said, I can't pretend that ship hasn't sailed. That's where we're at. We're not getting back to that. No one has the authority to do that. At this point, including the military, which kind of went ahead and said, we're not getting involved. So that's where we're at, and we have to deal with that. But let's just look at how bad this economic push is going to be. Just one other piece, a couple little pieces here, so you can understand all the pressures that are going to exacerbate. You have people not going in, so then you're going to have breaking of the sales tax. So we're going to go to Massachusetts here. This piece is from masslive.com, okay? Coronavirus shutdown could lead to 20% of state restaurants never reopening, Massachusetts Restaurant Association said. This was published by Michael Bonner on June 12th. About 20% of the restaurants in the state may never reopen as a result of the economic strain created by the coronavirus shutdown. Bob Lewis of the Massachusetts Restaurant Association joined a group of state senators for a listening session Friday morning and painted a picture with data from his members that reflected turmoil within the industry. Lewis said two different sources projected about 3,600 restaurants of the more than 1,600 in the state may close permanently in the aftermath of the coronavirus. And let me just make one point here. Aftermath, suggesting it's done. This is just what we're dealing with now. 1 in 5 restaurants gone from Mass, okay? And they rely on that. There's a lot of people up there. Governor Charlie Baker prohibited on-site dining in St. Patrick's Day in an order that was meant to originally last 3 months. In the 3 months following, Lewis said that 54% of the restaurants in the state remained closed, even with the state allowing takeout and delivery and outdoor dining with restrictions. And let's be very clear, I don't want to say anything bad about takeout. I understand why it's necessary, but the reality is, a lot of reasons why people go out is to enjoy the experience of being waited upon, of being served, all that. If you're just going to go get little takeout containers and a lot of times taking home, you might just conclude, as many people have, you're better off cooking at home. And that is something that has absolutely been the case. I understand what's necessary. I'm not criticizing it from a neurology perspective. I'm just pointing out the reality is that saying that, well, hey, they're open. Yeah, they're open where they're having takeout, which is something, and they're having social distancing if anything's open, where you have half as much people, but are they getting any help from the other side? Are they getting reduction in rent? Are they getting any of these things? No, they're getting loans. They're getting debt. And all you're doing is piling debt on top of debt on top of debt. And debt is a mountain that ultimately serves no productive purpose. So these are things we have to deal with, and what's happening is businesses are getting crushed behind it because logical behaviors in the economy is detached from the financing that works. Since March, Lewis said 93% of the state's restaurants have had to lay off or furlough employees. He said 87% of the 300,000 employees in the state have been laid off or furloughed. So 9 in 10 people almost, or let's use more accurate, 7 out of 8 people have ended up losing their job during this thing. And are they able to come back? Well, we see the second wave's coming, so the closures are here. What's going to happen? Those people aren't getting help. Rent's going to be due. I mean, could you extend it indefinitely? Maybe. I don't know. I mean, you're going to have to do something. The closure could not have come at a worse time for the industry, Lewis said. The industry lost $5 billion, Lewis said. Restaurants and bars missed key revenue dates such as St. Patrick's Day, the NCAA basketball tournament, Red Sox opening day, the Boston Marathon, school vacation week, Mother's Day, graduation ceremonies, and the industry will also miss out on Father's Day. When we open, we know that recovery is going to be extremely slow, Lewis said. We know that. We've known that the whole time. We're going to be constrained in a number of ways. The hardest hit areas, Lewis said, could be downtown Boston and Cape Cod, areas that depend on a high volume of people. In the case of Cape Cod, that's tourism. For downtown, it's office workers. On Monday, restaurants across the state were allowed to serve on site, but only outdoors with socially distancing seating. Lewis said the measure is only a small step, as 80% of the state's restaurants do not have outdoor seating. Municipalities like Boston, Worcester, and Springfield have discussed and implemented strategies that would possibly shut down streets for dining or allow the use of sidewalks. Business owners in all 3 cities have welcomed the closure of streets, which would greatly improve the capacity for outdoor dining. Sidewalk space, for some, doesn't offer enough space to completely reopen. Yeah, but how do you get the cars in there? You see, I mean, I'm not saying it's wrong. There's problems, right? And I appreciate that you're trying to deal with a hard situation. The economic struggles within the restaurant industry were compounded by the lack of help gained by the Paycheck Protection Program loans. The PPP did not work for the restaurant industry at all as it was originally construed, Lewis said. Well, it was a relief for most industries out there, and that's questionable. For a closed industry, essentially, it really did not help us at all. Lewis said PPP loans were meant to pay for employment, and closed restaurants had no salary to distribute. Instead, they needed help with rent and other expenses. The Massachusetts Restaurant Association advised its members in May to discuss rent payments moving forward with their landlords. Luz said that those who initiated the conversation, about 50% received some amount of help from their landlord. I think some landlords were thinking the PPP was going to be the end-all game, so some landlords may be loosening up as they realize it didn't really work for our industry, Luz said. And a lot of the renters, obviously, are people who work at restaurants, right? And in the retail sector, which has been crushed too. The Massachusetts Retailers Association experienced the same issues. Businesses that saw a decline in sales looked for ways to cut costs and decrease overhead. Rent ranked at the top of the list. And who owns rent? Well, why can't rent be fixed? Because collateralized loan obligations rely upon commercial value of property, which is called on payment of rents. So you want to know why we don't solve these problems? Who are we helping? Who are we protecting? Who are we not helping? Who are we not protecting? The topic of rent was one of the aspects brought up by the group of senators on the call, which included Senator Pat Gielan and Eric Lesser. Both associations asked the legislators to continue consider lowering taxes, and the retailers looked for a tax-free holiday. And the state can't do that, because if they do that, they have to pay for all these social services. You see the problem? Within the restaurant industry, Luz asked for lawmakers to make legal the sale of to-go cocktails and extend the repayment deadline for the meals tax. Each industry has tried its best to navigate through the pandemic, but each knows it can't survive alone. Together we win, Luz said. If we start saying this is all about me, we're never going to claw ourselves out of this. It's a great statement by Mr. Luz, but the problem is we are all going into our little tribes, and the media is cheering us on and to wear a different flag. Since we can't have sports on TV, we've decided to make a sport of our whole country. Isn't it a mess? One last piece, and then we're done. So this one is from the Boston Herald, just one more example of another industry that's going to get crunched. So if you ask how the economy is going to hold up, we'll see. Layoffs could be tip of iceberg for hard-hit hotel industry. So we talk about retail, we talk about restaurants, we talk about this. The plight of workers laid off from one of Boston's priciest hotels could be the tip of the iceberg for an industry particularly hard hit by the coronavirus pandemic, warns one union leader. The hotel chose to kick them out onto the streets, not abiding by their severance agreement that they'd had in their employee handbook, and telling them that if their jobs were recreated, they'd have to reapply along with anyone else from the street. It's a disgusting story, but the thing I fear more than anything is that this is the tip of the iceberg, said Unite Here local president 26 resident Carlos Arameo during a press conference on Sunday. Arameo was referring to layoffs at the Four Seasons Boston. And it's actually interesting, this is in the Boston Herald. Just for those who don't know Boston, the Herald's the right-wing paper, the Globe's the left-wing one, generally speaking. The hotel did not respond to a Herald request for comment. Layoff notices continue to stack up among hotel workers, even as the industry was allowed to reopen last week as part of Governor Charlie Baker's 4-phase reopening plan. The American Hotel and Lodging Association estimates 17,847 of the roughly 32,000 hotel jobs in Massachusetts have been lost as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. Even as the state gradually restarts its shattered economy, and let's see if it happens, considering that we're seeing the places that opened, well, it didn't really work for them, right? So will they do that? I don't know. Many furloughed workers are losing their jobs permanently, state data reveals. Furloughs reported to the Department of Career Services in March as the economy shut down and hotels closed in an attempt to contain the virus are becoming permanent. Roughly 2,600 workers initially furloughed earlier this year are now permanently laid off, according to recent notifications. Among hotel layoffs reported in June are 548 at the Sheraton Boston, 543 at the Boston Marriott Copley Place, another 348 at the Westin Copley Place Hotel, and 249 at the Boston Marriott Wharf. Each of those layoffs were effective mid-March. So we're talking about thousands of people just kind of being left without anything go. And this is just one city. I mean, what happens when you start adding these numbers across the country? People are going to be mad and they're going to be hurt, and the government's out there saying, one side saying, well, it's okay, That's not going to work. I mean, and there's no, I don't know how to put it. There's no leadership. There's no recognition of the problems, but... Aramero said Four Seasons cut in half its staff, and he's hearing rumors other hotels are doing the same. According to the state report, the Four Seasons laid off 108 workers effective March 20th. They threw us out the window without any regard for our families, without regard for how hard we've worked, said Ricardo Mateas, outside Senator Ed Markey's Malden home on Sunday. Mateus was a 21-year employee of the Four Seasons. Local 26 doesn't represent Four Seasons employees, but Arameo said the union is supporting workers. So that's what we have. So let's give a quick summary, right? What are we looking at? We're looking at, as I said, I mentioned that we have this virus that's making people a little crazy in the head, and we see a crazy society in result. We see people out there dealing with reopenings and spikes in case numbers happening out there, especially throughout the Sun Belt. But that was opened a little earlier. Now we have protests that have been ongoing since, I believe it started on June 3rd, if memory serves. So we should start seeing the leading edge, 6th. I'd say around the middle to end of the month. Seems like there's a little bit of a gap it takes to get going, but you're going to see these cities get hit again right about the time they're supposed to be really opening up. And then you do have people going out economically and other times. But this has been caught up in a whole bunch of other issues, and not that many people have died. And the doctors, to their credit, have figured out how to treat this well enough, I think, to prevent, in the absence of a mass wave of sickness, those who get this necessarily dying. And a lot of people are going to make the conclusion, well, we're just going to fight over this. And you look at the economic consequences of the first shutdown and how devastating they've been, the disproportionate response of corporate support and letting the people go to a really bad spot in this. The number of jobs lost, including people who are most vulnerable, the risks involved with people who can't pay rents, both corporately in terms of small restaurants and small-owned businesses that are being shut down, as well as individuals at the bottom end of the economic sector. And the fact that those with means, even though they support certain things, have disappeared into the countryside. You have everything exactly the way you would want it necessarily to have. More anger, upset, chaos in the summer, and the organizers are going to be out there taking advantage of it. The media is going to push it, and our government's too stupid to either stop, prevent, or calm it. So what happens? We're sitting at the edge of a lot of really difficult problems. And I'm not even talking about things. We got Kim Jong-un's sister out there saying, Kim Jong, I forget the woman's name here. Not that I know her that well or anything, right? But I just can never, remembering all these names is kind of hard. Kim Yo-jong out there saying, war with South Korea might be in the table. There's all this stuff out there. It's just so terrible, and it's just not getting better. It's getting worse all the time. So what do I tell you as the voice in the ether? What you need to do is being prepared for a lot of things to happen, including, like I said last week, the real potential economic collapse could be the third shoe to fall here with what we're looking at. I haven't even looked at the pre-numbers from, let's just take a peek what the futures are looking like on the Dow. And the Dow Jones Industrial Futures were down incredibly. It looks, in fact, like they hit a bottom at some point here. And they're predicting, I'm just peeking at the headlines on MarketWatch, stocks could fall a further 7% after last week's correction. And the stock market has been sort of insane, thinking that there's not going to be a second wave, but thinking we'll get through this, and in the long term, everything will be okay. And I think the market's finally beginning to acknowledge that all of these games they play aren't really going to work, and the golden parachutes already having been lifted out to the Hamptons and points more distant, we will now see that there will be the correction in the economy that will continue, that will lead to increasing and exacerbated layoffs, and we'll see what Congress does. I mean, at this point, it's amazing that in the middle of all these crises, the silence from our government has been deafening, and I don't know if there's something new on the table, but I would suspect that given how much acrimony exists, whatever emerges is likely to be very contentious and difficult for the sides to come together for all these different reasons. And I would acknowledge to you, you should be aware for those outcomes. So begin preparing. I would say that if you haven't invested in safety and security for your family, you need to be doing so now. And that the single best thing you can do for your security is to get to a place you want to be for the long term and begin laying some foundations. Don't assume that something available today is going to be available tomorrow. That very well may not be the case. And do what you can to keep safe from this, because the virus is still in this story, and before it's all said and done, it will serve, I suspect, a far greater role than just exacerbating existing tensions. I suspect it will become part of the story itself, because a weakened America is an America that the rest of the world can act upon. If you live outside the United States of America and you listen to this broadcast, I would say that get ready for the post-American world. It's going to be crazy for a while. If you are a guppy swimming next to a shark, you better start learning another language. That's what happens historically when it happens. Okay, so I will not be doing a show this evening because I have some things I have to take care of here, but I will be back to doing my YouTube shows on Wednesday, and I may do an afternoon show this afternoon on YouTube. I will post it if in fact I do, so keep an eye out for that. If you're not subscribed to the YouTube channel, what's your excuse? I mean, you get to ask me all sorts of ridiculous questions or very good questions, and I answer them all. So with that in mind, let's just go to the prayer. Heavenly Father, as we go through this time of chaos and discord, We ask that you guide us toward peace and unity in our own communities, in our own homes, and our own families, so we can be safe and so that we can go ahead and survive anything that comes in the future. This is a chance for people to have a reconnection. And while we did not use COVID, or at least not enough of us use COVID as the opportunity for that reflection, we are always grateful for the second opportunity you give for us to find wisdom, and that when we choose those options, we have the opportunity to experience a far greater and better life in safety and security of one another, and in future the greater truth, such as was taught by your Son, Jesus Christ. So in Jesus' name, I pray that we be led to such truth, and that we find our way to act in tranquility and to use the blessing of free will while we still may in this country to have better understanding. And I'll say that in Jesus' name, amen. I hope you guys all have a good week. I will say there's so much happening, and I'm only telling half the story because I really didn't want to get deep into the politics of it today. But I mean, honestly, I don't know how long this thing holds together. Take care of what you need to take care of this week. Between the virus coming out again and the fighting that's going to emerge, like I said, they're lopping off statues of Thomas Jefferson now. This will occasion a response. It's going to get ugly. I've heard that activists literally want to now take down the Alamo in Texas. That will lead to a war in Texas. I've been in Texas. I understand what that means to them. But you can't just erase history without there being consequences. If you want to make a new world, you have to destroy the old one. The virus was the kick to the shins that got the old world into a lot of trouble, and now we're watching it die. Good luck surviving in the new one. I'm here to go ahead and commentate on for you. I am Tom Kaczynski. This is Coronavirus Central. CV Central is the one program that tells you the real truth. We don't sugarcoat anything. Thank you for listening. For those who support and allow me to continue doing this, because there is no small amount of risk to telling the truth. It is a revolutionary act, as George Orwell once said. Your support is much appreciated. CVC PRV at Venmo. Thank you very much. God bless you all. Have a great day.